Not every day begins with a sense of pride. But that morning, as Simone Carter rolled her glossy brown leather suitcase across the main concourse of Dulles International Airport, she knew she was stepping into a new chapter of her life. Her hair was neatly pinned at the nape of her neck, and her charcoal gray suit hugged the strong curves of a woman who had built her empire with her own two hands. Each confident footstep echoed against the marble floor, as if striking a chord in the pride of an industry that had long tried to sideline her. Simone didn't need anyone's recognition. Her achievements spoke for themselves. As the founder and CEO of Aerospace, a leading aerospace technology firm pioneering green aviation, an AI-integrated flight system, she wasn't just a symbol of black excellence. She was the embodiment of perseverance, innovation, and an intellect that refused to be silenced. The first-class ticket in her hand wasn't a privilege. It was the product of sleepless nights, of hundreds of torn-up blueprints, of countless times she was labeled difficult to work with simply for speaking up in boardrooms full of white men. To Simone, the first-class seat wasn't luxury, it was rightful access, earned through everything she had endured. At gate 32, Simone paused. The spring sunlight streamed through the towering glass ceiling, casting a veil of artificial calm across the terminal. She offered a faint smile as the agent scanned her boarding pass and nodded her through. Everything was proceeding smoothly, just as it should. But the disturbance wouldn't come from the system. It began when she stepped onto the first-class cabin. The air smelled faintly of leather and cedarwood. Ivory leather seats lined up in pristine order. Most of the passengers were men in tailored suits, briefcases on their laps, AirPods tucked in their ears. Simone entered, her eyes quickly scanning for seat to AB the window. Just as she lifted her arm to stow her handbag in the overhead bin, a voice pierced the airnet loud, but sharp as a blade. "Boarding pass, please." Simone turned around. In front of her stood a flight attendant, short blonde hair, cool eyes, and a name tag that read Rachel Adams. No greeting, no professional smile. Just a hand, extended straight out, palm open, like a traffic cop demanding a driver's license. Simone hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but because the scene was so familiar. She had seen it, lived a scrutinizing glance that shifted from her ticket to her face. The way the world questioned her simply because her skin didn't match their image of belonging. "Of course," she said calmly, reaching into her coat pocket and handing over the pass. Rachel took it and stared at it longer than necessary. Her eyes dropped from the bold print first class to A to the name, Simone Carter. Then she looked up, right into Simone's face, as if searching for some flaw, some discrepancy. "This cabin is reserved for first-class passengers," Rachel said, not loudly, but each word was honed like a polite on the surface, but saturated with suspicion. Simone didn't flinch, didn't scowl, didn't let a flicker of emotion show. She merely nodded and replied, "I know, that's my seat." A brief silence. Rachel didn't respond immediately. She handed back the pass slowly, as if her hand resisted letting go. "Just making sure everything's in order," she murmured, just loud enough for Simone to catch the reluctance. Simone stepped towards seat 2A, placed her bag in the overhead bin, and sat down. Eyes began to flicker round her. Some passengers pretended not to look. Some looked and quickly turned away. But everyone knew what had just happened, and everyone chose silence. She buckled her seatbelt, leaned back, and stared straight ahead. But inside, a familiar sensation stirred. That feeling of being made to feel like an intruder even in the very industry she helped shape. The very world these men were profiting from. Her mind flashed back to another time when she was just 27, attending her first international aerospace summit. They had assumed she was someone's assistant, ignored her in meetings until her presentation was chosen as the 10-year roadmap for unmanned aerial flight. She was used to it, but that didn't make this fresh cut hurt any less. Minutes later, another flight attendant passed by offering beverages. Rachel was still at the front of the cabin, laughing with a white man in an Armani suit. Simone noticed he hadn't been asked for his ticket. None of them had, only her. And as she sat in silence, the cabin door sealed shut. The engines hummed softly, like a distant warning of something yet to come. The low rumble of the engines echoed through the first-class cabin, a subtle vibration humming beneath the soles of Simone Carter's feet. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaled deeply to steady her breath, but the scent of luxury leather and perfume from the passenger beside her couldn't mask the lingering stench of prejudice that had just brushed past her. A scent all its own, persistent, and unmistakably real. No one said a word, yet she could feel the air shift. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't loud, but a kind of tightly sealed silence. The kind people used to pretend they didn't witness an injustice just feet away, simply because they didn't want to get involved. The man to her right leaned ever so slightly into the aisle, as if to preserve an invisible barrier. The woman in front of her sneaked a glance over her shoulder, curiosity tangled with hesitation. Simone remained upright in her seat. She didn't adjust her clothes. She didn't bow her head. But inside, a wave was beginning to rise. She knew that look, wealth, one that always appeared when a black woman entered a space. Others believed she didn't belong, and it was precisely then that Rachel Adams returned. "Excuse me," Rachel said, her voice now laced with a strange sweetness, though the tension in her throat hadn't loosened. "We've discovered a system error in the seat assignment. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could temporarily move to the main cabin while we sort it out." This time, the words were more polished, more professional on the surface, but Simone could hear the subtext clearly. Another polite way to say she didn't belong here. She turned her head slowly to face Rachel. Her dark eyes were calm like still water, but beneath the surface were countless memories, honed and hardened into stone. Her reply was crisp, unwavering. "I'll be staying here. This is my seat. I've paid in full, as per regulations." The composure in her voice made a few nearby passengers glance up, not because she was loud, but because she refused to shrink. In this society, they were used to black women diffusing tension with smiles, soft apologies, or worse, insolence. Rachel's fingers clenched around her flight log, lips tightening. She leaned in closer, voice lowered to a firm warning. "If you refuse to cooperate, I'm afraid we'll need to involve airport security upon landing." Simone didn't answer immediately. She looked Rachel directly in the eye, not with anger, not with hatred. Just a gaze steady enough to make the other woman instinctively retreat, realizing she was facing someone who could not be pushed over. "You can do that," Simone said, "but make sure that in your report, you also note that the only passenger asked for their ticket, the only one asked to move seats, and the only one with my skin color was me." Her words, though quiet, struck like a blow to Rachel's pride. The man across the aisle blinked rapidly. A young woman to Rose's back turned to her boyfriend, her expression clearly asking, "Did you hear that?" Rachel swallowed hard. She wasn't used to being challenged like that. In all the times she'd followed procedure, few ever dared to confront her, especially not like this, with cold precision, with intellect, without spectacle. Just one sentence that made the entire cabin hold its breath. "We'll double-check," Rachel said hastily, then turned away, walking back toward the front of the cabin. Her movements no longer carried the poise of earlier. Something had cracked. Simone turned back to her seat, her hands resting calmly on her lap. But inside, she knew, the battle had begun. She wasn't someone who sought confrontation, but confrontation had a way of finding her. From being the only black child in her advanced math class, to being interrupted mid-presentation by less qualified male colleagues, this wasn't new. And what angered her most wasn't the insult itself. It was the fact that, after all this time, things like this still happened. Devon, after she had come so far. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, she looked out the window, where the April morning light shimmered across the glass. In her mind, memories overlapped like waves. She thought of her mother, night shift nurse, who spent a lifetime working hard, always telling her, "Don't ever let them tell you you don't deserve to be there." She remembered the day Aeroverse was named a national strategic partner in aerospace development. And now, that very industry she helped uplift had someone on its payroll trying to push her to the back of the plane. The flight hadn't left the ground, but her heart was already heavy. But unlike before, today she had power, not just financial power, but the power to speak. She reached into her bag and pulled out a tablet, slim as a letter. The screen lit up beneath the cabin light. No one could see the string of encrypted commands. She entered, but somewhere on the other end of Aeroverse's internal network, someone was about to receive a notification. A quiet alert about an irregular incident on Flight 74 to Commercial Partner Tier 1. And like a silent current, that report would flow beyond this cabin, past the clouds, straight to the desks of the executive board people who knew all too well that Simone Carter never pressed the red button unless something was gravely wrong. She closed the tablet. Beneath the gray suit, her pulse remained steady. Prejudice might pierce the skin, but it couldn't penetrate the steel resolve forged through blood, sweat, and 30 years of persistence. The plane trembled gently, then lifted off the ground. Simone closed her eyes for a moment, but this time, not to retreat from real literature, to prepare for it. She knew falling wasn't the end, and for someone who knew how to rise, a fall was often where transformation began. The seatbelt chime echoed through the cabin, blending into the steady crescendo of the engines as the aircraft leveled out at cruising altitude. Outside the window, the sky stretched into a velvet blue, streaked with wisps of cloud trailing behind the flight path. Simone Carter opened her eyes. Her dark pupils glinted with a cold alertness. She hadn't slept and allowed herself a moment of stillness to regulate her breath. Psychological warfare required pause, not for retreat, but for recalibration. And as if the universe wanted to test her resolve one more time, Rachel Adams returned to first class. Not to apologize, not to offer a drink, but with a clipboard in hand and a hardened expression. Quiet murmurs flickered through the rows like sparks through dry grass. The passengers who had witnessed the earlier exchange froze, gazing out windows or adjusting their masks, anything to avoid confronting their conscience. "I'm sorry, Ms. Carter," Rachel said, her voice syrupy sweet, but her eyes cold as slate. "It appears there's been a data discrepancy. We'll need to relocate you to the main cabin, seat 3C. The main cabin, the row near the lavatories, by the engine, where seats didn't recline, and heads knocked against armrests every time someone passed." Simone didn't need further explanation. She knew this wasn't a system glitch. This was a deliberate choice. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady, voice laced now with the faintest trace of irony. "So I'm being relocated to make room for whom? Someone with special needs, a pregnant woman, or simply someone you deem more appropriate?" Rachel pressed her lips together. The question, though free of accusation, laid bare the truth she couldn't admit. No one answered. No one needed to. Because just moments later, as Simone stood, not in surrender, but knowing resistance now might lead to her being forcibly removed, a young white man in a hoodie and jeans hurried into the cabin. Rachel's tone shifted instantly. Her smile switched on like a light. "Welcome, sir," she beamed. "Seat 2A, right this way. I'm sure you'll find it comfortable." Simone remained still. Her hand tightened around the strap of her bag as she watched the man sink into the seat she had just left, reclining as if used to being favored by the world. No apology, no glance from those around her. It all unfolded as if this were the natural order of things. Simone stepped through the curtain separating first class from coach. The soundscape changed instantly. Babies crying, meal trays clattering, murmurs bouncing off the crowded walls. A confined, chaotic, spacious, stark contrast to the serene luxury she had just exited. She found seat 3C, an aisle seat, boxed in between a large man devouring a sandwich and a middle-aged woman glued to her phone. Simone slid into her seat, folding herself to avoid contact. The rickety tray table in front of her clicked mockingly, like a taunt at her sudden descent in status. Just then, Rachel reappeared. This time, to ask for help. "Excuse me, "Miss," she said, bending slightly, her voice dripping with fox sweetness, "there's an elderly woman needing help with her overhead bag. Would you mind assisting?" Simone looked up. Her eyes were like mirrors, reflecting surprise, quiet injury, and finally, resistance. "Have you asked anyone else in this cabin to help with luggage?" Simone asked. Rachel didn't answer. "I'm a passenger," Simone continued calmly, "not part of your flight crew." Rachel pressed her lips again and tried to smile, but her face betrayed her irritation. "I just thought it might be helpful for everyone. Helping is your job, not my obligation," Simone said plainly. A man across the aisle raised an eyebrow. The large man beside Simone cleared his throat, clearly having overheard, but no one spoke. Rachel turned and left. Her actions, no longer veiled in pretensity, were now unmistakably blatant. The resentment of losing control was evident. Because the target of her disdain refused to play victim, Simone didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't lash out. She remained silent. And that silence robbed Rachel of the narrative she wanted to command. When the meal cart made its way down the aisle, Rachel served each passenger, smiling and offering extra snacks in row 31. But when she reached Simone, she didn't pause. The sandwich, the drink, the tray all bypassed her as though seat 30C did not exist. Simone stared at the empty tray table in front of her. A silence settled around her. Then she calmly pressed the call button. A young male flight attendant approached, eyes nervous when he saw Rachel nearby. "Excuse me, ma'am, what can I get for you?" "Just a bottle of water," Simone said, "if there's any left." He nodded and hurried off, returning moments later with a chilled bottle. As he handed it to her, his eyes held quiet remorse. Simone took it, nodded gently. No performative thank you. Just a look enough for him to understand that she valued the gesture more than any apology. At that moment, Simone reopened her tablet. Her fingers moved swiftly across the screen. A new report was initialized. Aeroverse's internal codes lit up like a beacon in darkness. She typed succinctly, "Flight 740 to protocol breach, discriminatory behavior, clear eyewitnesses." At the bottom, a single encrypted line, meant only for executive review. "Request activation of emergency contract termination clause, Carter Protocol 7. The flight continued, business as usual. But within the aviation industry's network, gears had already begun to turn, and Simone Carter sat there in a cramped seat, back straight, eyes sharp with a fire lit by public humiliation, now burning steadily in her chest. The airplane cabin was bathed in a soft amber glow from the overhead lights. A light meal had begun to make its way from the front of the plane, the faint scent of toasted bread and coffee curling through the air. But in row 31, Simone Carter felt nothing but a cold, silent void wrapping around her. She had submitted the report. Skyling Caravers's most secure internal network had received the red alert, triggered directly by ACEO-level clearance. A single, silent tap that was, in truth, the first tremor of a coming quake. One Rachel Adams and the entire airline had no idea was approaching. Meanwhile, Rachel continued working the cabin, her politeness now a rehearsed performance. As she passed Simone, she didn't so much as glance her way, as if the black woman she had just humiliated out of first class had never existed at all. Simone wasn't surprised. This was a common strategy: harm someone, then erase their presence like it never happened. But this time, she wasn't consumed by the feeling of being erased, as she might have been years ago. She had spoken up, and in this world, sometimes, one small action at the right time was enough to tilt the axis of injustice. The metallic rattle of the food cart grew louder, rolling down the narrow aisle. Each plastic tray was handed carefully to passenger 6 for 1. When the cart reached Simone's row, it simply rolled past. Simone looked up. Rachel didn't acknowledge her, didn't ask if she wanted a meal. She simply served the passenger beside Simone and moved on, as though nothing unusual had happened. The woman next to Simone, a well-dressed middle-aged passenger in a crisp white blouse, glanced at her. then dropped her gaze without a word. "No meal for me?" Simone asked, her voice calm but loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear. Rachel stopped, turned slowly. Her face wore a smile, but her eyes gave away the irritation burning underneath. "I'm terribly sorry," she said. The crew prepared the exact number of trays according to the current manifest. "There may have been an oversight affecting only one seat," Simone replied, her lips tight, her voice not raised but carrying a gravity that made people listen. No one spoke. Not a single passenger in economy dared to react, even though many eyes had begun to shift uneasily. A few looked like they wanted to speak up but didn't. That silence, it was so familiar. It almost felt like a character itself, a silent accomplice. Simone tilted her head slightly, closed her tablet, and placed it neatly on her barren tray table. She wasn't hungry. What burned in her chest wasn't hunger for food but a hunger for justice. A hunger that, over all these years, had never been satisfied. A young man, just 2 rows ahead, quietly pulled out his phone. He aimed it toward Rachel as she skipped Simone's seat again. The footage shook slightly as his hands trembled. Simone knew what he was doing, and she also knew what would happen next. Sure enough, less than a minute later, Rachel noticed. "You there?" she barked, still trying to sound professional. "Recording passengers is prohibited. I'm going to have to ask you to delete that footage immediately." The young man froze, caught off guard. "I was just filming the way you were treating her unfairly," he said softly. "That's a violation of our privacy policy," Rachel replied, her voice rising, her face flushed with anger she could barely contain. "If you don't delete it, you'll be removed when we land." Simone stood up. Once again, she didn't cause a scene. She simply stepped toward the young man and looked Rachel square in the eyes. "If your policy is meant to protect passengers," Simone said clearly, "then this video is doing exactly that." Rachel stared back, her eyes a volatile mix of fury and fear. For the first time since pushing Simone out of first class, she realized someone else was watching. This wasn't just a vague sense of wrongdoing. This was evidence. The young man slowly put his phone away, but Simone knew, just a single frame. The first few seconds shot was enough. The world didn't need a long video to recognize injustice. Just a sliver, and they would judge. Murmurs started rising among passengers. No one was casually flipping pages, watching movies, or dozing off anymore. The atmosphere was electric. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Rachel turned abruptly and stormed toward the front of the cabin, leaving a trail of uneasy glances in her wake. Simone returned to her seat and adjusted the light scarf around her shoulders. She had sat through hundreds of boardroom meetings, dozens of international conferences, and had spoken face-to-face with some of the most powerful investors in the world. But never had she felt more clarity than in this moment. Truth doesn't need a microphone. It only needs to be seen. Thousands of miles away, at Aeroverse headquarters, a red alert had already been triggered. The Senior Partner Operations Office had received a flagged emergency report. The Chief Strategy Officer personally opened the file labeled, "Urgent Ethics Violation on Flight 742. Attached was a full incident log submitted by Simone Carter, including clear documentation of discrimination, seat reassignment, and misconduct toward a VIP-level passenger. Within 7 minutes, the board of directors was notified. The internal communication grid activated. An emergency meeting was scheduled while the flight was still in the air. No one on that plane realized that the quiet woman in economy held the key to a contract worth nearly $1 billion. And now that key had started to turn. Simone knew she didn't need to shout to be heard. She only needed the right eyes to see. She glanced at her tablet, where a new internal message had just appeared. Received. Forwarded to Executive Director. Awaiting rapid response protocol. Hold your position. She exhaled softly, not because she was about to win, but because, for the first time, she wasn't alone in a battle no one used to see. And with that first button pressed, The wheels of justice had begun to move. The soft hiss of wind brushed past the aircraft windows. Flight 742 continued steadily at cruising altitude. But inside the cabin, the atmosphere had completely shifted. Simone Carter sat upright in seat 3C, the gentle light from the reading lamp casting a warm glow across her face. No one dared to overlook her anymore, not even those who had turned away before. Their eyes now held something harder to name, and not quite support. Not pity either, but an awakening. Faint yet undeniable. Sometimes, it only takes one person, Simone, who refuses to bow for the silence of complicity, to begin unraveling. And Simone knew that was starting now. The woman in the white blouse, the one who had turned away. When Rachel skipped Simone's meal, glanced over, her head tilted slightly, hesitant. "What would you like my role?" she asked softly. "I'm not very hungry." Simone looked at her, then gently shook her head. "Thank you, but I'm fine." A small gesture, but one heavy with meaning. The woman blushed, then nodded, her hands folding in her lap as though she'd just realized, for the first time, how her silence had been part of the problem too. To rose up, the young man with the phone had begun quietly tapping out a post on social media, his fingers swift and deliberate. Flight 742 just witnessed blatant racial discrimination. She was kicked out of first class even though she had a ticket, denied a meal, got threatened for filming it. No names, no lengthy footage. But in this age of connection, just a few lines could spark a wave. Up front, Rachel Adams no longer carried the calm demeanor she had worn earlier. She was unraveling, though no one on the flight crew had yet addressed her directly. She could feel the quiet judgment behind the eyes of the young male attendant, who had brought Simone water and been scolded for it not long ago. Rachel blocked his path as he pushed the trash cart down the aisle. "Matt," she said in a hushed but stern voice, "you're out of line. I'm lead flight attendant on this flight." Matt stood straight. His eyes had lost their hesitation. "I just did what my conscience wouldn't let me ignore." A silence dropped between them. Rachel opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure whether to threaten or plead. On the tablet of another flight attendant, Lindsay, who oversaw a business class, a system alert lit up in red. "Emergency notice. Flight 742 underactive. Monitoring. Ethical conduct violation reported. Do not delete data. Log all interactions." Lindsay read it twice. Sweat began to bead at her temples. She knew instantly this wasn't a routine message. This was a red-level alert, issued only when senior management had intervened remotely. And if someone at that level had triggered it, that passenger must hold serious authority. A question began to form in Lindsay's mind. Who's the black woman in economy, above the clouds? The flight was smooth, but on the ground, nothing remained unchanged. At Aero vs. San Francisco Operations Center, an emergency meeting had been launched via secure video link. The head of legal, PR director, flight safety supervisor, and even the deputy VP of marketing had been pulled into the call. "They want a formal statement within the hour," the executive assistant reported. Simone Carter's representative just submitted a detailed incident report, with live time-stamped images. "I thought she was just a corporate passenger," someone asked. The legal chief shook his head. "She's the lead signatory on our $900 million tech integration deal. She decides whether this airline remains our official partner." A chill swept through the room. Back on the plane, Rachel returned to economy, trying to maintain a neutral expression. But the cabin's energy had shifted. Passengers no longer avoided her gaze. They looked straight at her. A middle-aged man nodded quietly when Simone met his eyes. A young woman stared Rachel down with a sharp look, her fingers still scrolling Twitter. Rachel knew people were beginning to see. She stopped in front of seat 3C. Her eyes wavered, her face tensed with something close to fear. "Ms. Carter," for the first time, she used Simone's full name. No sarcasm, no ambiguity. Simone looked up. "I'm sorry if there was a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding," Simone said, her voice soft but firm. You chose to act that way. And I choose not to stay silent anymore." Rachel stood frozen. Simone continued calmly, "And you might want to check your company's internal system. Chances are, by now, my name's been flagged under priority client." A single clap rang out from somewhere behind. At first, it sounded out of place. Then came another, and another, until the cabin filled with soft, steady applause, not loud, not angry. Just a quiet show of solidarity for the woman who had refused to be anyone's victim again. Rachel turned and hurried away. Simone sat back, her eyes drifting closed. She didn't smile. She didn't smirk. But a deep stillness began to settle inside her, the kind of stillness that comes only when you've spoken your truth, and you know someone finally heard it. With just over an hour left before Flight 742 was scheduled to land in San Francisco, a media earthquake was already rumbling beneath the surface. On the LED display in the 19th floor conference room of Aeroverse headquarters, red text blinked continuously, breaking. Alleged discrimination on Flight 740 to central figure identified as executive engineer of Scanova Aerospace. A 30-second video, filmed by the young man on board, was being shared at lightning speed. It showed Simone being blatantly denied a meal while other passengers were served without question. There was no yelling, no physical confrontation, only the heavy weight of silencing a black woman sitting upright, unyielding. That was all the internet needed to ignite. On board, Simone Carter didn't know how far the video had spread, but she didn't need to. She could feel it clearly. The tide was turning. This shift wasn't about Rachel's half-hearted apology or the delayed, reluctant nod from the junior attendant. It was in the eyes of those who had once turned away, no starting to look directly. In the passengers who had once ignored her, no whispering things they no longer avoided. Simone opened her tablet. A message from her strategic advisory team lit up the screen. "We've received directives from the board. All data is being secured for internal review. The situation is more serious than anticipated. Media outlets are already involved." She folded the tablet shut and closed her eyes briefly. What she felt wasn't victory. It was a sense that the time had come. In the galley at the back of the plane, Rachel Adams gripped the mini-fridge handle as if clinging to something slipping from her grasp. Another attendant had just finished reading the internal alert and turned quietly to Rachel. "What's happening, Rachel?" she asked gently. Rachel glanced at the screen built into the galley wall, where a new line had appeared. "Serious ethical breach under immediate board review." She swallowed hard. No answer, no more excuses. She knew, this time, there would be no sweeping it under the rug with vague reports or plastic smiles. Lindsay added softly, "She's Simone Carter, lead figure in Scanova's tech investment program. She represents a $900 million contract. We messed with the wrong person." Rachel trembled. Her face had gone pale. Her hands stayed clenched on the fridge handle. The captain's voice rang through the cabin, announcing the upcoming landing. Passengers were asked to fasten their seatbelts. Simone took a deep breath. She had landed at countless international airports, but never one quite like this inside. She was preparing not for a presentation, not for a billion-dollar negotiation, but for a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. When the wheels touched the runway, the cabin fell into an eerie silence. No applause, no relieved sighs, just a tension, as if everyone was waiting for what came next. The chime sounded. The seatbelt light switched off. Passengers began to rise. Simone remained seated. She adjusted her coat, tucked her tablet neatly into her bag, each movement deliberate and calm. As the aircraft door opened and she stepped out with the crowd, it was immediately clear the arrival gate was anything but ordinary. A group of individuals in black suits stood gathered near the jet bridge. Some were speaking rapidly into wireless earpieces. A tall man in a dark suit, general counsel for the airlines, and the crowd, searching. He saw Simone first. His expression shifted and at first, then almost cautious. "Miss Carter." He approached, his voice low and respectful. We've arranged a private room to immediately address the incident." Simone didn't break stride. She replied softly, "I'll attend. But not because you asked. I'm here so you can hear this clearly. The silence of institutions is never neutral. It's complicity." The man halted. A single clap came from behind her, then another. Not yet a full applause, but enough to make the suits nearby glance nervously. Meanwhile, Rachel Adams was being held in the crew break room. She'd just been summoned by HR through an emergency message. For the first time in 8 years of service, she didn't know what was waiting behind that door. She unlocked her phone. Social media was flooded with hashtags. Simone Carter Flight 740 to Rachel Bia's. A short video was now circulating, a clip from boarding, with Rachel saying, "We'll need to move you to the back row for safety reasons." Her face in the video cold, authoritarian, devoid of empathy, looked nothing like she imagined herself. Rachel gasped, stepping back. She no longer controlled the narrative. Simone entered the VIP lounge, temporarily converted into a crisis response room. The communications team, legal advisors, and even the airline's executive director were already present. The air was heavy. She set her bag on the table. "Remain standing. No need to sit." "I didn't come here to negotiate damages," she began. "I came to draw a line. Scanova will not partner with any organization that tolerates discrimination where cloaked in polished language or buried in procedural ambiguity." No one interrupted. They knew at this point no excuse would matter. Meanwhile, reporters had gathered beyond security. Local news had already received anonymous leaks. Scanova executive removed from first class. On Flight 742, photographers adjusted lenses, microphones hovered. The media storm was about to break, and at the center of it all stood a black woman who had refused to stay silent. Flashbulbs burst across the glass outside the VIP lounge at San Francisco International Airport. The media had arrived. They didn't need an invitation. Scandals had a scent, and this one was thick in the air. This wasn't about a delayed flight or a lost suitcase. This time, the target was a name shaking the internet: Simone Carter. Inside the lounge, the atmosphere was dense. The suits around the emergency meeting table exchanged tense glances. The airline's PR director, a thin woman with thick glasses, was hurriedly drafting a formal statement, but her hands trembled with every keystroke. She knew one wrong word could trigger a storm they could no longer control. Simone stood apart from the table, arms folded across her chest. She didn't sit. She wasn't here to negotiate. A young assistant approached, whispering, "Miss Carter, the press is outside. Some are live streaming already and demanding a company spokesperson. If you prefer, we can escort you out through a private exit." Simone turned, her eyes steel sharp. "I'm not going anywhere." A beat of hesitation. "And if they need a spokesperson, I'll be the one to speak." She didn't wait for their approval. She didn't need it. Rachel Adams sat alone in a small staff room nearby, a sealed bottle of water on the table. Her forehead glistened with sweat. Her phone had been confiscated for the internal investigation, but she didn't need social media to know the world outside was on fire. The way her colleagues looked at her when they disembarked, those weren't the eyes of teammates anymore. They were the eyes of witnesses. A knock on the door, no warning, no small talk. Someone from HR entered with a clipboard. "We need you to sign this temporary suspension form. You'll be interviewed within 24 hours. Rachel looked up, lips drained of color. "I was following protocol. I didn't mean to." "You've been accused of discrimination, threatening a passenger, and abuse of authority." The staffer cut in calmly. "Today, we're not discussing your intent. We're addressing your actions." That response sliced through her final thread of defense. Outside, as Simone stepped through the VIP lounge doors, every eye turned toward her. One camera switched to slow motion, capturing the click of her heels on polished white stone. No waves, no posed smile, just a woman in a deep navy suit, spine straight, gaze unflinching. Reporters surged. "Miss Carter, are you suing the airline? Were you targeted because of your race?" Can you confirm you represent Scanova Aerospace? Simone didn't flinch. She stood in the center of a dozen camera lenses and said clearly, "My name is Simone Carter, and I just spent 3 hours on a flight operated by the airline you're asking about, during which I was downgraded, denied service, and threatened with airport security, even though I paid for a first-class seat, and more than thought I am the lead negotiator on a $900 million strategic partnership deal between Scanova Aerospace and this airline." For a split second, the crowd went silent. "This isn't just about me," she continued. "It's about everyone who's ever been told to stay quiet, everyone who's been seen as a problem, simply because they didn't fit someone's image of who deserves to be on a plane like this. For years, I said nothing. This time I won't." Someone from the airline stepped forward, trying to interrupt. But Simone spoke over them. "And let me say this to every company out there. If you believe that discrimination can be hidden behind polite smiles and vague ethics policies, you're underestimating the world we live in. Social media will not stay silent. Consumers will not forget. And Scanova company will no longer do business with you." A round of applause rose from a small group of nearby passengers. Some pulled out their phones. A new hashtag appeared within minutes: Simon Speaks. Back at the airline's headquarters, investor calls were flooding in. "Tell me this isn't real," one shareholder shouted into a speakerphone. "We just lost our biggest strategic contract, and believe Mesh won't stop there." The CFO stared silently at the stock ticker, watching it plunge 9% in under an hour. Meanwhile, at Scanova, the video of Simone's speech posted to the company's official LinkedIn page was exploding. Follower counts spiked. New partnership inquiries were pouring in. Media headlines began calling her the woman who shook aviation with a single stand. In a dark room at the back of the airport, Rachel was still being held. She had heard the applause. She knew the game was over. But what hurt most wasn't the suspension or the collapse of her reputation. It was watching the clip of Simone speaking. When Rachel had once believed she'd never dare. Some truths, once revealed, cannot be unseen. Rachel slumped forward, hands over her face. No one needed to yell at her. She already knew. That evening, as Simone exited the airport through a discreet gate, a small crowd was waiting. There were no interviews, no flashes, no pushing forward. Just quiet presence. Some were young aerospace engineers. Others were former passengers who'd once felt voiceless. And a few were simply people who had followed the story online. A young woman stepped forward and handed Simone a small piece of paper. "I'm an aerospace engineering student," she said, voice trembling. "I used to think this field wasn't for someone like me. But today I think differently." Simone took the note and nodded, saying nothing, a small gesture. But this time might mark the beginning of something far greater. And she knew this was only the first chapter. That evening, as night blanketed the city of San Francisco, the lights inside Pacific Crest Airlines headquarters remained lit. The board of directors was present in full. The emergency meeting stretched into its fourth horn. No breaks, no small talk, no forced laughter. The airline's stock had dropped over 13% in just 24 hours. The red, blinking numbers on the screen offered undeniable proof. This was not a minor PR hiccup. It was a full-blown crisis. But what truly terrified the executives wasn't just the loss of a strategic partner like Scanova. It was the unprecedented tidal wave of public backlash. The hashtag Simon Speaks was still trending. Over 22 million views on the now viral video in less than half a day. Major outlets like CNN, The Atlantic, and the New York Times ran editorials, calling it a wake-up slap to the U.S. commercial airline industry. Across town, in a modest third-floor apartment, Rachel Adams sat alone on a sofa. Her phone lay motionless on the coffee table, access to company systems revoked. Her contract suspended, and now nothing to cling to but the silence gnawing at her thoughts. No calls from friends, no comforting messages from colleagues. She tried turning on the TV, only to flip through channels in agitation. unable to stomach Simone's face appearing on every news report under the headline, "The Woman Who Said No." Rachel thought of her Mothra white woman, who once taught elementary school always taught her to maintain order, trust the system, and don't stir the pot. But now, that order felt like a prison. She had never dared question it. Not until today, when that very system had pushed her to the margins. She looked at herself in the mirror. Gone was the polished image of the model chief flight attendant. In its place, a woman staring into the eyes of the worst version of herself. At Skinova Aerospace headquarters, Simone Carter was already back in her executive office after a short night's rest. The morning sun streamed through reinforced glass panels, sharpening the determination in her expression. On her desk sat a thick dossier labeled Flight 740 to Internal Review. Beside her was Sophia Cheng, Skinova's newly appointed Director of Multicultural Strategy, personally recruited by Simone. Following the restructuring agreement, "We've finalized the partnership evaluation framework," Sophia said calmly. "Any airline or organization wishing to work with us now has to pass 3 clear benchmarks: transparent policy, anti-bias awareness training, and proven crisis response behavior." Simone nodded. "And they'll sign public pledges. No more quiet deals in conference rooms." "What about Rachel Adams?" Sophia asked gently. "The airline said an independent investigation is underway. But personally, she's disappeared." Simone was quiet for a long beat, not out of resentment, but understanding. People like Rachel don't vanish. They hide, they deny, and sometimes they collapse. But sometimes one of them tries to change for real. That afternoon, in a quiet cafe in the city's southern district, Rachel Adams reappeared. Her hair was pulled back, her white shirt wrinkled, but her eyes no longer held the aimless drift of the day before. She sat across from a black woman in a burgundy sweater, no flashy makeup, no jewelry. Dr. Geneva Rhodes, senior advisor at the New Horizons Initiative, an organization that supports individuals seeking to take accountability for social harm and genuinely rebuild. "In your email, you said you're not running from responsibility," Geneva said, her gaze steady. "So be honest, Rachel. Why are you really here?" Rachel hesitated and spoke plainly. "Because I can't sleep like this. Because I saw the eyes of the people who witnessed it. I saw Simone's eyes. And because I realized I've become the person I used to be afraid of becoming." Geneva pressed her lips together. "Then let's begin, not with an apology, but by relearning everything from the ground up." The following week, at a Skinova-hosted symposium on racial equity in service industries, Simone Carter stepped onto the main stage before a packed auditorium. Representatives from airlines, young engineers, aerospace students, civil rights advocates, and individuals who had experienced discrimination themselves were all in attendance. No music, no flowers, just quiet reverence. Simone didn't start with a speech. She began with a single, measured truth. "We don't need a perfect world. We just need people brave enough to fix what's broken." When the floor opened for discussion, all eyes shifted toward the back row where Rachel Adams slowly rose and walked to the microphone. "Hello," she said, her voice gravelly. "I'm the one who did wrong. But I'm not here to defend myself. I'm here to say, if I can face the shadow of who I was, then maybe so can this industry." There were murmurs, some skeptical, some approving, but Simone didn't look away. She watched Rachel closely, not with anger, but with assessment. Not everyone deserves a second chance, but at least one person was trying to earn it by starting from the very bottom. A week after the symposium, the ripple effect of what Simone Carter had done stretched farther than anyone had initially predicted. It was no longer just a media scandal, no longer a battle between a powerful executive and a negligent airline. Now, it had become a catalyst, a rare moment of reckoning for the entire commercial aviation industry. The first call came from Horizon Airline of Pacific Crest's biggest competitors. Their CEO, Alan Renford, personally sent Simone an invitation to attend a strategic roundtable on corporate cultural restructuring. not as damaged contribute to learn. The letter was handwritten, with a note tucked inside. We used to think we were immune. Now we realize we've been sleeping in a house that's already on fire. Simone said nothing at first, but deep down, something stirred, not pride, something more cautious, something like hope. On LinkedIn and Twitter, former airline staff, flight attendants, engineers, and passengers began sharing their own stories when they were told to stay quiet, passed over for not fitting the ideal look, or denied chances simply for being who they were. The hashtag #RedraftEsky began trending, symbolizing more than just policy change. It was about rewriting the very blueprint of how this industry sees, values, and treats human beings. Skanova didn't wait. Simone activated the Clearsky Initiative, a sweeping reform blueprint with 3 core mandates: retraining 100% of employees with anti-discrimination education, reassessing every strategic partner through an equity audit, and incorporating independent cultural advisors into every operational phase moving forward. But perhaps the most unexpected moment came that Friday, when a simple envelope arrived at Simone's office. No logo, no title, just a small printed name in the corner: Rachel Adams. Simone opened the letter, expecting nothing, but the handwriting ground steady, deliberate. At her pause, Rachel didn't plead for forgiveness. She didn't deflect blame. She wrote about shame, about how her dream career had been warped by habit and by so-called procedures, masquerading as professionalism. She wrote about the symposium, the eyes of the young students in the crowd, and about turning down a job interview with a smaller airline backhouse. She felt she wasn't ready to return to the skies unless she could do so as a changed person. The last line of the letter made Simone stop and read it twice. "I'm not asking to return. I just hope to move forward in a direction that means something." In that moment, Simone remembered herself 15 years earlier, her first internship as a young black aerospace engineer in a research center in Arizona. She had been called the wrong name every single day, and no one corrected it. She had stayed silent until one day, an elderly white professor with silver hair and deep, kind eyes quietly told her, "If you stay silent long enough, the world will believe you don't have a voice." Simone never forgot those words, and now they returned inside a letter from the woman who once made her vacate a first-class seat. She turned to her assistant and said simply, "Set up a private meeting with Rachel Adams." No press. The meeting was held on the top floor of Skanova's headquarters, in a small, unmarked conference room. Rachel arrived exactly on time, dressed simply, no makeup, her posture straight, but clearly uneasy. When she entered and saw Simone standing by the window, she hesitated. "Sit," Simone said without turning around. "I didn't bring you here for a media moment, and I'm not here to judge you." Rachel nodded quietly and took her seat. Between them sat a pot of warm tea and a slim folder. Simone turned to face her. "I read your letter, and I'll ask you plainly, if I gave you a second chance not to be a flight attendant again, but to become a trainer in anti-discrimination education, will you take it?" Rachel froze. She had come expecting to apologize, to close a painful chapter, not to be handed a new one. I don't know if I deserve that," she whispered. "None of us are ever truly deserving," Simone replied. "People don't step into justice because they're perfect. They do it because they choose to walk forward even when they were once part of the problem." There were no grand speeches after that. But when Rachel left the room, she carried a 6-month probationary contract with Skynova, her new title, Field Advisor for Cultural Reform. Her task, to help design a training model for new airlines entering the Clearsky program. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't erasure. It was a Chancheto, repair the past with present action. At the end of that month, a major event took place at Federal Aviation Administration headquarters. Simone had been invited to deliver the opening address at the Future of Aviation Equity conference. On stage, she shared her story but didn't linger on what had been done. She spoke of systems, of silence, of how we often hide injustice behind the facade of order. And then she ended with a declaration: that made the entire auditorium rise to its feet in applause. We don't need airlines that fly faster, cleaner, or cheaper. We need airlines that fly in the right direction. And that direction must be justice. Back at her office after the conference, Simone received a small package with no return label. Inside was a handcrafted wooden model of a passenger jet, carved with tiny, careful lettering, "We belong." Service Aeroware, a group of young staff, were being trained in how to engage passengers from diverse cultural backgrounds. The instructor for that session was Rachel, no longer a chief flight attendant. Now, she was sharing what she had lived through, enough to understand, enough to look back with clarity. "Would you like to join in for a bit?" Rachel asked, noticing Simone at the doorway. "No," Simone replied gently. "I think you're already doing better than I could." Later that afternoon, at Skanova headquarters, the communications team began receiving responses from international airlines. A Scandinavian carrier requested to join the Clearski program as a pilot partner. A Japanese airline submitted paperwork to adopt Skanova's human rights-based crew evaluation system. Even an airline conglomerate, once sued for racial discrimination, back in 2017, sent a letter proposing renewed partnership as time, with a promise to begin again with transparency. Sophia Cheng, Skanova's chief cultural strategy officer, entered Simone's office near day's end, holding a new set of proposals. "We received 3 new collaboration requests today," she said with a smile, "and all of them asked to be assessed under our standards before negotiations." Simone gave a soft laugh. "I never thought ethics would become a competitive advantage. It's the only thing people can't fake." Sophia replied, "They can fake hospitality, but not respect." That night, in her apartment, Simone opened a drawer and took out an old plane ticket. Her original first-class ticket from years ago, once torn by someone who didn't believe she looked like she belonged there. She placed it in a glass frame and hung it on the wall. Beneath it, handwritten in ink, "Every seat earned with dignity must be defended with dignity." As she turned off the lights, the glow from outside cast the shadow of the frame onto the wall like a quiet seal left behind. It wasn't just the past, it was a promise. The next morning, the first flight under the Clearski program took off. Inside the cabin, every passenger was handed a small booklet. Embossed on the first page were the words, "If you've ever been asked to stay silent, this is your space to be heard." A 7-year-old brown-skinned child sitting by the window read it aloud to his mother and asked, "Mom, does that mean I get to speak to?" His mother nodded, eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, baby, and from now on, the world has to listen." The aircraft rose into the sky, cutting through dense layers of cloud, headed toward the future.